Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Have we reached the tipping point or close to the tipping point where we cannot reverse the ill effects of climate change, such as melting glaciers, rising seas, and expanding deserts? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at what many people believe is the #1 problem affecting the world, climate change. And we're going to look at what we can do perhaps to reverse or at least slow some of the negative effects of climate change. My guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Scott Carlin. Dr. Carlin is an associate professor of geography at Long Island University in New York. At the United Nations, Dr. Carlin is a non-governmental organization representative for the International Society of Doctors for the Environment. Dr. Carlin, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for the invitation, Bill. It's a real pleasure.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into climate change in a minute, but let's talk a little bit about the International Society of Doctors for the Environment. What is this group? When was it formed, and why was it formed?
This is an organization that was formed by medical doctors. It was formed back in 1990. And they were looking at the world's environmental situation, seeing how serious the environmental problems were becoming, and saying, you know, we really need to have an organization where doctors from around the world can speak with one voice about the seriousness of issues relating to climate change, global deforestation, and a host of other environmental issues that are on the tables of, at the United Nations and national bodies around the world.
And now you're one of the UN representatives for this group. Do you attend conferences at the United Nations, and participate in various programs?
One of the advantages of being a professor of Long Island University is that I am in close proximity to New York City and the UN Center here. And so whenever I can, I do try to come in here and attend some of the conferences that are held here, particularly those related to sustainable development.
Now, you do have a website, www.isde.org, that our viewers can go to get more information about that group. Let's talk about climate change, and we'll talk about, bring it down to Long Island University. You're from a moderate-sized school, about 4,000 or 5,000 students, but your school is one of the really avant-garde schools as far as dealing with the sustainable development issue, climate change. Briefly, what are some of the emphases that you have on campus and in the community to deal with this problem?
We've created a brand new master's program in environmental sustainability. The goal is to train our students in understanding good science, being able to interpret scientific data, and then be able to communicate that data to a wide range of different audiences. So they're really becoming adept at being facilitators of conversations about sustainability in a wide range of contexts. It could be a business context, it could be a governmental context, it could be pulling different nonprofit organizations together that are working collaboratively on research that really requires a scientific component.
This is so extremely important, and we've all got to focus attention on this because this is an issue that's going to impact all of us. Are you looking at ways you can move from fossil fuels to green energy, alternative forms of energy?
One of the classes that I teach at LIU is the class on sustainable energy systems. So we're looking at things like solar energy and wind power, hydroelectric power. Those are some specific technologies, some specific systems that the students will investigate, both in terms of the technical side of those systems, how they function, but also in terms of their implementation, the economics of these systems as well. But we also look at the larger context, the entire economic system, the global systems, and we say, how do these technologies plug into those other kinds of larger structural systems, and why is it that we don't see the connections that the students are so eager to see happening faster in the world. You know, why aren't we having governments invest even more in renewable technologies in the United States, the way some of the European countries have been doing? Those are the questions we look at in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think the science is settled? Have we really reached the point where the debate is over about climate change, it's happening, and we need to deal with it?
That's a great question, Bill. A lot of times in the mass media, we do hear a lot about the pros of climate change being something that scientists are concerned about, and then we hear this alternative position that maybe the science isn't settled. I think for the vast majority of the scientific community, we're talking about 97% of the scientists that are actively involved in climate science, say this is a settled matter. The issue of carbon dioxide, methane, other kinds of greenhouse gases contributing to the warming of this planet, this is settled science for the scientists. Now we're working on the details of exactly what that means, exactly what is the timing of different kinds of changes that might take place on the planet, such as the intensification of drought. This is something that's going to be quite serious for the agricultural community and really the world community as we try to struggle with the fact that precipitation patterns are going to shift significantly as we get later in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've had this debate on fossil fuels, and we're having it right now about how some groups want to keep coal, oil, and gas. We see that the clean energy fuels are coming online. Can we move from the polluting industries to the clean industries and do it economically and still maintain high-paying jobs for people without putting people out of work or causing them to go into some type of economic downturn or something like that?
For $1 million invested in renewable energies like wind and solar versus $1 million invested in oil and natural gas, you get a lot more jobs out of the renewable technologies. And so from an economic point of view, the best investment for us is definitely, just in terms of the jobs alone, is going with the green technologies. But that's really just the beginning of the whole process of rethinking what our energy system should be like in the future. We really need to pay a lot more attention to the interface between public health issues and energy issues. These things are tightly woven together. Coal is a significant contributor to air pollution. We know that coal contributes to asthma and other kinds of respiratory problems. And so if we can dial down the amount of investments we're making in coal, start to turn off some of those coal plants and move the money and the investments into green energy, we're going to see dramatic improvements in public health indices as well. So when you start to factor those kinds of things in,
the tipping point, which I believe was coined by former U.S. Vice President Al Gore in his book, An Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah.
What does the tipping point mean to you, and have we reached it, or are we just about to reach it?
One of the things that concerns scientists is that we don't live in a linear world. We live in a world that's structured by all kinds of complex feedback loops. And some of those feedback loops are called positive feedback loops, meaning one change begets another, which begets yet more changes. You can think about economic growth. Nations try to pitch a 3% growth rate per year, so that 3% on top of 3% compounds over time. Well, climate systems work in the same kind of way, where a set of temperature changes can also precipitate other kinds of changes that happen in the environment. We know, for example, that as the ice caps are melting in the Arctic North, the amount of ocean that is exposed is increasing. Well, the ocean waters absorb more heat and they accelerate the heating of the Arctic region. So that's a positive feedback loop where heating begets more feeding. And the concern is that there are many different systems in our Earth that are acting in that manner, where these positive feedback loops can start to have some runaway effects, or at least effects that become much more expensive for us to mitigate.
Now, that appears to be what's happening right now.
Yes.
The glaciers are melting faster. We thought that was above the water. Now
Yes.
they're melting under the water, or the icebergs and what have you, under the water. And this is really accelerating at a much faster pace than scientists thought maybe 10 or 15 years ago, is it not?
The pace has accelerated faster than expected. But I think one of the things that the public has trouble understanding is that scientific statements are designed to be conservative statements. So scientists want to make statements where they're 90 or 95% confident in the results that they've found. Well, in order to have that high level of confidence, it also means that their results have to be more conservative. And so what we're finding is that there is a lot more change happening out there in the real world because the science that has been laying the foundation for all this has operated from some conserving principles whereby it's been hard for even the scientific community to adequately express what the underlying realities have been in terms of how these systems are changing.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we look at the situation today, you look at oil, coal, and gas industries, they have trillions of dollars of resources underground, and they have a financial investment. So you can see why they're arguing to keep moving in that direction.
Yeah.
But by the same token, what are some of the other obstacles? Do we find that the media are not focusing on this problem, that they're not covering it properly? We find members of Congress are beholden to corporate interests to fund their campaigns. What are the problems? Why are we not making the changes?
We're not making the changes because not everybody understands the science of climate change the way climate scientists understand it, or the way people who follow that climate science very closely understand it. People have all kinds of investments, ideological investments, financial investments, and naturally they're protective of things that they've invested a lot in personally or institutionally in. So it's not surprising that an entity that's a large oil and gas conglomerate would be protective of their interests and that they would speak loudly to elected officials about that. And it's certainly not surprising that elected officials want to recognize the jobs and the clout that comes with an industry like oil and gas. How do we get over that? It is a very complicated question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. But we do know that democracy is a really important tool in all of this. It's very important that people write to elected officials. It's very important that people get active in their local government. Local governments can make enormous changes, as we were talking about earlier today with the greening of our cities. There was the protests that happened around the world in September where people took to the streets and said climate change really is one of the defining issues of our day, and I'm going to take the day off, I'm going to march with my friends, and we're going to say to our elected officials, we're going to say to the oil and gas industry, listen, business as usual, it's not going to work for us anymore. We really need to see a new path happen. It's not surprising that the China-US agreement happened just a few months after these large protests happened around the world. I really do think that they have some effect in at least accelerating the pace at which elected officials feel they have to respond back to the public with meaningful reforms.
Mm-hmm. And as we look at the situation now with the various governments and the various entities that are focusing on this, well, earlier we were talking about the various cities taking the lead, perhaps in the government, ahead of the national governments in some cases. But we also find that there are certain governments that are really moving forward very quickly. I guess everyone's moving forward to some degree in combating climate change. But you look at Denmark. That's a country that looks like it's going to be fossil fuel free in the not too distant future, at least the majority of its energy coming from green sources. You look at Germany that's focusing on solar, and Germany's not very well known for a lot of sunshine. It's a beautiful country, but they don't get a lot of sunshine. But it seems like there are some best practices out there we can look at and really try to emulate them in the various countries where we live.
Absolutely. And it's, I think, always going to be the case that somebody's going to step out front and say, you know, we're going to be the leaders on this. And for whatever reason, they're able to galvanize political support, financial support in order to make that a reality. I think that's an incredibly important part of how our world system functions, is that some states are able to step out and exert that leadership. What has to happen is we have to be able to communicate those successes effectively enough to the rest of the world so that they start to accelerate the kinds of changes that they can make as well. And I think we're getting close to another kind of tipping point, which is a tipping point where we say, you know what, if it's working in Denmark and it's working in Germany, then why not make it work in South Carolina? Why not make it work in New York? Why not make it work in the country of Nigeria? So these kinds of things will start to accelerate over the next 15 years. The question is, are we doing it fast enough? And I think the answer still is we're not, but we're going to start to make the kinds of changes that should have been made earlier, We will pay a financial, we will pay a humanitarian penalty for all that, but we're going to start moving in the right direction. At least I remain hopeful we are.
Mm-hmm. And that's what many of the experts today say. It's going to cost money to make the shift, but it can be done, and it will benefit the societies in general in a lot of ways. You mentioned about in the public health through a reduction of greenhouse emissions, reducing carbon footprint, and that type of thing. So there is an opportunity to do this. But let me ask you in closing, in the last 30 seconds or so that we have, are you optimistic? Do you think we can still reverse this, or at least slow it down to the point where we can adapt to these changes that are with us today, not coming tomorrow in many cases, but are here today?
The kinds of changes we're going to see in the world are going to get a lot worse. In that sense, people are not going to have a sense of this being mitigated. We're going to enter a time period where climatic disasters, other kinds of effects are going to be quite serious. But that's also going to propel us to make a much faster set of investments in the correct direction. And you know, we're just going to do the best we can with all this. People who are part of the nonprofit NGO world, we have to speak with a louder voice. We have to find a way to get heard by the elected officials and by other institutions faster and more effectively. And that's just, we have to get that work done.
Exactly. And of course, that's what you're doing through the International Society of Doctors for the Environment.
Exactly.
You're doing it through your teachings at Long Island University, and it's really quite commendable what is being done at that moderately sized university and what you're doing. And it is so important that we do listen to experts such as yourself and others, because it is a clarion call. It's not trying to be alarmist, but it's just looking at it very, very logically, very pragmatically, and saying these conditions are occurring. We know what's causing them. Fossil fuels are causing them primarily, and not totally, but primarily, and we need to do something now to make sure that we have a world tomorrow. But Dr. Scott Carlin, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.